I'm delighted to welcome three beloved professors and now best-selling of authors multiple times over, Jaideep, Prabhu, Priyank, Narayan, and Dr. Mukesh, Mr. Professor Mukesh Sood to Network Capital. They've written a best-selling book, LeanSpark, but I'm very much interested in how this collaboration sort of happened. So talk to me, Jaideep. How did the three of you meet? What's this book all about?
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you so much, Utkarsh, for inviting us onto your podcast. The book is called Lean Spark, Frugal by Design, Global in Impact. Um, we are the three co-authors, myself, Priyank, and Mukesh. I have been writing and thinking about Jugaad for several years now and frugal innovation more broadly. And then at some point, Priyank, who's at Ashoka, and teaches there, invited me to do guest lectures, which I would do sitting in Cambridge online. Um, and and then he and I would talk a lot about Jugaad and how it was evolving in India, how this space was sort of maturing in India. Separately, I met Mukesh on a flight to India
Oh,
and discovered not only that he and I had some things in common. We had both studied at IIT Delhi, for instance, as has Priyank, by the way. Um, and that Mukesh also knew Priyank, and that they taught together at Ashoka. So the three of us ended up then teaching a course together at Ashoka on Jugaad in the tech enterprise, where we were looking at how this idea of Jugaad was maturing, how one could perhaps take some of the best aspects of Jugaad, this ability to think creatively within under constraint, to come up with highly affordable solutions that can scale. So to take the good bits of Jugaad without some of the downsides, like lower quality, perhaps cutting corners, that kind of stuff. And we also began to look at a lot of examples of where, in India in particular, we were seeing companies of all sizes and even companies or organizations in the public sector that were increasingly able to marry the Jugaad mindset to tech and scale their solutions, their highly affordable solutions. And all that repeated sort of discussion and classroom interaction and teaching then led up to the book Lean Spark. So that's a little bit from me, but I think maybe we should ask Priyank and Mukesh to tell their side of the story.
yeah, I'd love to because I'd met Priyank in the middle of his research, or perhaps the research that the three of you were doing for this book in London for a bit. And we had like a short interview. So I would love to hear from both of you, actually, Priyank and Mukesh, about the serendipitous connection to Lean Spark.
The standing joke in academia is that if you want to learn about something, you offer a course in that. And in our conversations, we started following the stories of frugal innovation, especially in the tech world, and we decided to offer
Mm.
a course around that. And that's how the collaboration really came together. But Mukesh has a more fun story to share.
Utkarsh, I am a late convert to academia. I did a PhD when I was 40 when I joined IIM Bangalore. And as a student, I was happened to be in Cambridge. So I looked up all the professors who were there, and there I saw Jaideep Prabhu's name. So I sent him an email. But here I was, an unemployed guy, mid-career with very little future in academia, and Jaideep didn't respond.
Well,
So
why very little future, even out of curiosity, why?
generally, people who do a PhD start in their mid or early 20s and they make a career for 40 years in an institute. So a mid-career change is always looked at rather suspiciously as to why you're doing it and whether you
Very
can
useful
contribute to
advice
the
for
field.
me, yes. I am doing my PhD. I'm not 40, but not in my early 20s.
Okay. So Jaideep, I believe, this is my version of the story, ignored me. And then I saw him when we were boarding a flight in London and coming back to Bangalore. And I said, I know this guy. And I quickly pulled out everything about him. And I smiled at him. He probably couldn't recognize me and he ignored me. And I told my wife and my son who were with me, this is the guy who ignored me when I went to see him in Cambridge, or when was in Cambridge. Anyway, long story short, we were waiting to get in, and they called business class passengers first. And Jaideep walks in into the business class, and my wife tells me, "You stupid guy, you are doing a PhD so late. That is why you are in economy. This guy did his PhD early, and he's now in business class."
Oh
Jaideep was
my
also amused
God.
with this, so I think he did his homework. Jaideep, continue the
Right.
story.
Anyway, Utkarsh, you've got to make up your mind on who you believe, Mukesh, Priyank, or me. Anyway, we
I
all
will
met and
triangulate
we
my
become good
findings and let you
buddies.
know. Yeah. So, Jaideep, I mean, a final anecdote. When I was applying for my PhD, I also reached out to Jaideep for advice, and he was very kind to me. And as of both of you, I've known Priyank for a long time, and through him, I also got to know you, Mukesh. We've done a podcast before. So there's a clear connective thread that I see across your respective works. But Jaideep, I want to start with you. Talk to me about the connection of LeanSpark with the papers that you've written earlier in your career and your previous book. Why did you feel the need to address this topic?
Yeah. Yeah, great. So, around 2008 or so, I became interested in innovation in India and emerging markets like India. And I realized when I started doing that, that the approach in these emerging markets where you have resource constraints and where you have large numbers of people on lower incomes, the approach to innovation is different from the West. The West in innovation, particularly in large companies, is much more structured. It's quite expensive. You have big teams and so on. And it takes time. And then you charge customers for whatever comes out of the process.
Mm.
So you make your money on the margins, not necessarily on the volumes. But in India and other emerging markets, you have very large numbers of people on relatively low incomes. And so what I found was that there were a lot of solutions that were highly affordable, where companies of all types were, making their money not on the margins, which were razor thin, but on the volumes. And so I came across, scores of such examples of these kind of frugal, flexible, inclusive innovations, between say 2008 and 2010, 11. And in India, when I asked people how they would describe this kind of frugal, flexible, inclusive approach, they would often use the Hindi word Jugaad. So my co-authors and I ended up writing a book on Jugaad, which came out in 2012. And that book, got a lot of attention. Some people liked what we were doing, others were not so happy, and
Mhm.
raised a number of criticisms, which stayed with me. So people would say, hey, this is actually the worst aspect of how Indians do business. Often it's unethical or illegal sometimes, or people are cutting corners and quality is poor. And even if you get a great solution, it doesn't scale. So I kept thinking about
Right.
all this. And again, these are the kinds of questions that would come up in classes that, I taught with Priyank at Ashoka. And that was the impetus for the three of us to then teach a class, as Priyank was saying. That was the way we thought we'd learn about how Jugaad can be improved, so to speak, where you could get the best aspects of it without the downsides. And then, we started to look at examples of how this was being
Mm.
done. And that led to LeanSpark. So the thesis of LeanSpark is really that, in India now, the system has matured to a point where Jugaad can be actually married to tech. And in that kind of marriage, we see the ability to scale Jugaad and to reach very large numbers of people on relatively low incomes with highly affordable solutions, and then take those solutions elsewhere to other parts of the world, not just other emerging markets, but also the West. So that's a little bit about LeanSpark.
So the
Let me just add.
hypothesis was very strong. You believed in it. You were able to connect this work. During the course of this podcast, I'd love to hear from the three of you how you tested this hypothesis, what's the kind of pushback you got, and how did you validate some of the findings? And maybe we can do a case study or a discussion around ISRO, if that's okay. Yeah.
Yeah. Mukesh, you were going to say something.
Yeah, so let me add here that the question or the research question is, could Jugaad move from being a process to a mindset? And if it is a mindset, then you learn to use resources conservatively. You learn to do more with less. And then could that be a competitive advantage? Could that force you to think differently? And can we do that when we scale? So
Mm-hmm.
we are distinguishing between Jugaad as a tool to resolve a problem today to a mindset where we say that we will do more with less by thinking differently.
Utkarsh, the third part that I want to bring in here is
Mm.
that, Jugaad is something so Indian and so ingrained in the way we brought up in India that it's hard to see it being seen negatively. And we felt
Mm.
at all points of time that there is so much of positive value you can get out of a Jugaad mindset and a Jugaad approach to sort of solving problems. That how do we bring in that element of positivity to frugal innovation, to Jugaad, to something which is so ingrained in the way we look at problem solving and approach. So that was really the part that we kept working on and exploring and kept on trying to find examples of how startups, how governments, how people, how different personalities have used this to scale,
Mm.
to grow, and to really be successful in whatever they've done. So that's the genesis.
Can we
And
share a couple of examples, please?
yeah, so I know you want to get into ISRO, so maybe we can hold off on ISRO. But perhaps the most spectacular example of this kind of approach in India has been India's experience with first Aadhaar, the unique ID, and then of the whole India stack that built on it, including the UPI or Unified Payments Interface. So that whole thing, let's start with Aadhaar. The vision was very consistent with this LeanSpark approach. So let me first talk about the elements of the LeanSpark approach, this mindset that Mukesh was talking about, and what Priyank was saying, the positive aspects. So there are four kind of aspects of this that we highlight in the book. One is lean execution, and so that is through experimentation, rapid iteration. You execute, you come up with prototypes,
Mm.
and then you scale too in a lean way, in a frugal way. The second is what we call purposeful simplicity, where right from inception, the design stage itself, you are very mindful and strategic about achieving your goal of affordability and scale. And so you come up with the design that is suited to that objective, and ideally only those features or attributes that are essential. And that also helps you achieve your objective of an affordable solution that scales. The third is what we call adaptive scalability. So this is where you have modular designs and so on that can and you have interoperable elements that can help you recombine elements to adapt your solution to different situations. And the final one is what we call systemic sustainability. So again, from inception, you're thinking about reducing waste, reducing negative externalities. So now going back to Aadhaar and UID, right from inception, there was this vision that it has to be something that all Indians will have, because particularly those who are in remote areas on lower incomes. So to be able to reach all those people, you have to do it very affordably, particularly since you're using government money. And so there is built in this idea of lean execution. There is this idea of purposeful simplicity. So, for instance, they double down on just, getting very little data, essential data, the fingerprints, iris scan, name, date of birth, address, maybe phone number. That's it. And so the third thing was a lot of sort of modular design elements, interoperable pieces, coming up with a standard for the equipment that would be used to enroll people, and then having enrollment done by others depending on their situation and so on. And then finally, also just thinking again about the long-term social impact and trying to reduce externalities. So That would be an example, not just the UID, but then building on it a UPI, the so-called India Stack, which then again scaled to the population, very affordable to the population. It was free. Then you have these interoperable open source APIs to allow fintechs to then develop solutions which could adapt to their particular customer base in their particular region, etc. And now this is not only something that has been highly successful in India, but is now being taken to other countries who are trying to adopt similar kinds of digitalization of their financial services sector.
So, Utkarsh, if you look at how you compare this to similar programs that have worked in different parts of the world, it's a very interesting comparison, right? So, today, if you look at how the social security system works in the US, which has been running for the past many decades, it still costs the government about $100 to issue one ID. Compare that to what we have as costs in India, and that's also structural. Structurally, we've designed it that way. Is just $1. It's 100 rupees actually. If you look at Dubai and look at Emirates ID cost, it's about $40 or so per ID that it costs the government.
Hmm.
So if we were at that point of time looking at the American model of putting IDs together, we would have gone completely off because the country couldn't have afforded a model that costs $100 per person. And because we went in the frugal way, because we decided to do it in a simple way with the simplicity element that Jaideep was explaining, we were able to scale it. And because we were able to scale it, we were able to bring in the cost down even further. And that creates a positive flywheel, right? Where you're able to scale, lower the cost, and because you're able to lower the cost, you're able to scale further. That's where the real kicker of frugal innovation, lean innovation really comes in. And
Hmm.
that's what you can see very beautifully done in the story of Aadhaar and UID.
Amazing. I want to ask a question. Feel free to not answer, Jaideep or anyone. Is Jugaad or the LeanSpark model typically applicable in countries with institutional voids, or we should not think of institutional voids and Jugaad and LeanSpark together?
No, I mean, there is an intimate connection because often those, and it's not just institutional voids. I would argue it's also infrastructural gaps. These go hand in hand. And it is because of these voids and gaps that you have, incomplete markets or missing markets in many cases. So take the whole issue of financial inclusion. India in 2009, 2010 was a very mixed story in terms of financial inclusion, despite the Reserve Bank and the banks having a mandate to bank the unbanked. Very large numbers of the population, possibly upwards of 50%, were outside the banking system and therefore outside the formal economy, unable to get all the benefits of scale and efficiencies and being able to access credit and all this kind of stuff. So then in a situation like that, what the government did in partnership with the private sector, first to give people unique IDs that they could then link to the benefit system. So benefits could then go into their bank accounts directly linked to the unique ID. Of course, for that, they also had to open a lot of new bank accounts. But actually, what made it easier now to open bank accounts for the banks was that they could do electronic KYC, electronic know your customer, which
Hmm.
reduces the cost dramatically because they had a digital ID and didn't have to use paper. And so that aspect of being able to uh, introduce digital infrastructure and digital institutions that would support that digital infrastructure. For instance, once we get to the UPI, which was also then a collaboration between all the banks and the central bank, where they develop these interoperable open source APIs. There's infrastructure there, but also there has to be legal institutions, which set the stage for how you might monitor and deal with issues like fraud and money laundering and all this kind of stuff. So you have to build that infrastructure and the institutions that go along with it as a way to plug the gaps that might have existed before, or to reduce costs that introduce all the frictions that exist in, say, financial services that get in
Mm.
the way of people being banked. So I think there's an intimate link between the two. And again, this is where there has been a progression in how we think about Jugaad. Because I think in the past, Jugaad was a kind of a sticking plaster, right? It was a quick
Mm.
fix. You had an institutional infrastructure gap, and that created an opportunity for you to come up with a kind of improvised solution to kind of plug the gap. But I think that's what we're talking about in LeanSpark. We've progressed from those kind of sticking plaster solutions, which are temporary, which are improvised, to more systemic solutions, more holistic solutions that are more long term, and where there is a deliberate focus on the long term outcomes. It has to be sustainable in the long run. And this is what Priyank was saying as well. It has to, for instance, scale. And because it has to scale, you make it affordable. Because it's affordable, it scales. And then you can create this positive flywheel. So, yeah, I think that's a great question to ask. And there is a clear link in my mind between gaps, institutional, infrastructural, and this kind of thinking.
And let me just jump in here because scalability was also very intentionally done by saying that we will do the minimum in house. Let's outsource everything. Let's have a few high grade vendors, show them a very large numbers, 1.4 billion, and let them bring the costs down. But if you try and do it in house in the government, you know how government schemes work. And there was a likely change in government coming up with elections due. So it was very strategically handled that let's get across the hump, get in 2, 3, 400 million people, let them see the benefits, and then the scheme will be unstoppable because there'll be user demand that we want to be controlled. In fact, there were stories at that time that there were riots in some UID centers because people were queuing up the night before saying, we want the benefits that the other villagers got.
Fascinating. What I'm hearing from all of you is sort of the institutionalization of Jugaad to match the ambitions of these emerging economies, and of course India being a fascinating case study. But within India also you have cases where the government is involved in different layers of way, and this is across governments as well. It's not dependent on a particular party necessarily, but perhaps these innovators had already factored these changes in mind, which makes the case of something like ISRO truly fascinating. And the point that I try and make in my analysis of space sector in general is that there are institutional voids sometimes even in mature markets, but they are rather industry specific. So if you study the American space industry, some of the challenges that Priyank was referring to when he was speaking about Aadhaar and UID, etc., were not very different from the challenges that NASA experienced when trying to develop or trying to revitalize itself after its lunar ambitions were taken care of in the 60s. And then bureaucracy, costs, it just blew out of proportion, innovation stalled. And there was no way for the private sector to enter or emerge. It became extremely challenging to do any jugaad, any innovation, any institutionalized jugaad, nothing of that sort, except for the large incumbents. And then the government worked with different players, design mechanisms, tried to address that. So it's a really interesting, framework for people to think about if you've developed in this. So let's discuss a bit about ISRO because it's a source of national pride for all of us. But it's also, as scholars, you would find it like a great case study to make your point. So talk me through the ISRO as an example.
Yeah. So you could argue that actually ISRO is the original LeanSpark example in India. We just discussed UID and India Stack. That's much more recent, but ISRO has been doing this since the 60s with, again, many elements of LeanSpark. For instance, having that long-term vision, the idea that, even though we are a relatively poor country and was certainly much poorer in the 60s, with limited resources, space technology, satellites in particular, offered huge benefits to the mass of India's population, particularly farmers, with helping with weather prediction and so on. And that this became kind of essential infrastructure for a developing country like India. So that vision of being able to achieve something quite remarkable for a very large number of people, but then also being very aware of the constraints, right? And realizing very early on that whatever we did would have to be done within very constrained resources, not just money, people, etc., right? Um, and so, right from the beginning, there was this marriage of what we are calling the Jugaad mindset or the frugal mindset with tech, um,
Mm.
and this idea of doing lean execution, purposeful simplicity, again, purposeful simplicity. So great clarity on why they were going into space. It wasn't about, like, unlike NASA, which was about the space race with the Soviets first, and now you could argue with the Chinese. In India's case, it was very linked to developmental objectives, very linked to, a young nation, having to bring along very large numbers of lower income farmers in particular and help them improve their productivity and so forth. And so, some of the elements of what we talked about, the lean execution, the purposeful simplicity, the adaptive scalability, modular design, interoperability, the Lego-like sort of elements in the hardware. You think about the rockets used to launch these satellites. And also, I would say again that perhaps a little less so the systemic sustainability, but certainly on the social front, recognizing that this would have to be sustained over decades, not just a
Mm.
few years. You could argue that the American approach, NASA's approach in the 60s, the space race, was extraordinarily expensive. So much so that they couldn't sustain it, right? And also, what were the objectives? Once you won the race, what else were you doing in space? So I think ISRO is the original example, and the results are there for everybody to see. Priyank was talking about the cost of IDs in other countries, but we could look at the cost of sending a mission to Mars. We could look at the cost of sending a mission to the moon, and ISRO's costs of doing all that are a fraction of the cost of NASA's or the European Space Agencies or the Russians or the Chinese. Perhaps the Chinese are closest to us in some way in that kind of spirit. But even they now have resources they can throw at all these things. And India, even as it has grown, has retained that frugal mindset. And it's not just because, we have the constraints, it's also because the fruits of those activities have to be affordable, just like with the ID, because the beneficiaries of it are relatively on low income. So anyway, that's my take on ISRO, but I know that Mukesh and Priyank will have lots to say as well.
No, I just have a brief interjection here. It's interesting that ISRO does not hire IIT and IIM grads. And that's a question to ask ourselves, that despite that major constraint that the best minds in science and technology, they're picking up students from normal, regular engineering colleges, training them, getting them hungry, and achieving extraordinary goals. So you see the totally different approach that ISRO has from a cultural aspect also, that it is embedded in them to do more with less.
Mhm.
Also, women, very large number of women
Lot of
are
women, yes.
employed in ISRO. Some of the leading technologists and scientists in ISRO over the years have been women. So that's another extraordinary aspect. And it's not been replicated in other parts of the Indian public state sector. There were other such initiatives, but they somehow weren't able to do quite what ISRO was able to do. Priyank, you'll have something to say,
Yeah.
I'm sure.
So, Utkarsh, one of the things that we wanted to establish through our work in LeanSpark was that it's not the frugal mindset or the Jugaad approach or lean approach is not something which is just meant for stuff that you do at home or stuff that you do in a small organization or for a startup. Through
Right.
the story of ISRO and space and tech, what we want to establish is that even in high precision industries, even in areas where there is a lot of need to bring in the best technology and the best people, this model still works, and this model has given great results. And again, to give you numbers, the budget for an ISRO mission was typically 700 crores, which beats, which is, I mean, most Hollywood movies would beat a budget like this. In fact, if you look at some of the new, homegrown flicks like Durandar, they've made more money than the kind of money that was required to send people into space. So really, it comes down to that mindset of structuring organizations and thinking of how it can be done at scale. And again, it has to start from the top. It has to have the people leading the organization need to have that mindset of not using the constraint as an excuse for not doing. And in this case, as a country, we could have said, no, look, we don't have the resources, we can't go beyond the earth.
Yeah.
So really, it's proving that point, that anything is possible, and quite literally, sky is not the limit when it comes to working under constraints.
And now you see the recent example, in fact, of this morning, where
Mm.
Skyroot, an Indian startup, has been declared a unicorn. It has been estimated to be worth more than $1 billion. So once you start on that route, then you can scale up and you keep the
Mm.
mindset the same, but the methods then change. They are no longer doing Jugaad, but you have adopted that mindset and you then scale up.
I think
Yeah.
this is
There's one
another
more interesting
interesting
point, Utkarsh,
aspect.
that I'd like to make on this, which is not everything in every mission and every project and every organization needs to be frugal and lean and jugaad. It's a spectrum. There are certain times that
Mm.
you will rely on the power of frugal innovation and find solutions, and the other times you will have to follow the process. You will have to follow the
Mm.
systems and make sure that you are not off at all because of the precision and the requirements of that job and that task. So don't always say that Jugaad or Frugal will have all the solutions. LeanSpark will work in combination with many other practices that you have in your organization,
Mm.
as long as you are willing to listen to ideas that are leaner and not just look at finding a resource heavy solution.
Fascinating. I was just trying to understand how did you come up with this framework? And if you could explain whether this purposeful clarity, is it always set for the top, or is some sort of negotiation happens between different rungs of the organization? You're the ones who came up with the framework, so I don't want to put words in your mouth, but would love to hear more.
Yeah,
Obviously, all my
so
questions are to all of you. Feel free to answer the way you
yeah,
like.
yeah. Actually, Priyank gets the credit for coming up with the framework with these four elements. So maybe we should ask him. But let me just say that it doesn't have to come from the top because, the two examples we've looked at in the last few minutes have been the sort of very big structural kinds of things, right? Nation building. But in the book, we also cover lots of startups. And in a startup, yeah, this is a founder, co-founder, small team. You could say they're the top, but they're starting off small, and that's in the startup phase. And then when they scale up, then they have to get people from other parts of the organization to support. And if you look at multinationals, the people at the top may set the kind of course, but then others have to do the entrepreneurship and the innovation. So it doesn't always have to come from the top, is what I would say.
Yeah. So, Utkarsh, a very interesting question. I would say there are two elements to it. One, that the lean spark mindset has to be very deliberate. It's not something that just happens because you want it to happen. You, as a team, often as leadership, often inspired from the ground, one has to be very deliberate that we will work with whatever constraints that we have. And second is that it needs to be front loaded, which means that, what Jugaad was in the past or is seen today is a hack on the fly. LeanSpark is not a hack on the fly. LeanSpark is putting down all the constraints, acknowledging them, finding a solution, and then putting that solution as a part of your overall strategy to get past the solution. That's where you'll get the scalability, that's where you'll get the simplicity, and that's where you'll be able to sustain this over a period of time. Otherwise, we'll struggle and go back to the negative aspects of Jugaad and try and hack a solution on the fly.
Another aspect I would like to point out is that we have covered a wide variety of examples from large companies to startups and companies in between. And part of it is built on the lean startup approach, where companies start something with an MVP, a minimum viable product, test it on customers and get feedback. And that is something that all startups are doing. But the interesting part of that story is that the lean startup and the original book was not written with the intent for startups. It was meant to address the question that large companies are facing, which is that this small operator is coming and disrupting our business model. But it's so intuitive, LeanSpark, Lean Startup, that everybody is now following that route and saying, let's start lean and let's scale as we learn more, as we get customer feedback and improve our product or service.
Right. Personally, for me, I didn't ever understand the criticism or critique of Jugaad because it seemed intuitive to me that the author is not saying that Jugaad is the only way forward. Jugaad can be the starting point, or Jugaad is the way you start innovating, and then the country or the company gets on the innovation path and cycle. It is more of the catalyst rather than. So this critique I never fully internalized. But there have been, different people who've pointed out different ways to look at the same one. So if you look at a lean spark, is it applicable to emerging countries, emerged countries? Is it a new way of thinking about everybody? Like, walk me through who's your
Yeah,
audience? Who did you really want to um, maybe inspire would be a strong word, but like
yeah.
really like address when you came up with it.
So the LeanSpark book, as it currently exists, was very focused on India and the Indian situation. We do have some
Mm,
examples from elsewhere, but it was mainly to address the criticisms of Jugaad that we came across in India, and it's mainly
mm,
got Indian examples. That said, another area that we look at in the book, which is one that is ubiquitous these days, which is AI. And
yeah.
in the AI space, there is a very interesting debate again between two rival approaches. One is the Silicon Valley approach, which perhaps the Chinese are trying to rival. This is going back to the same kind of thinking that we saw during the Cold War between the Soviets and the Americans. You basically outspend the other. You outspend the rival. You come up with higher spec large language models which are ever larger and are doing much more than you can even possibly know what to do with. That's very expensive in itself. Then you have to have these very high-end expensive chips, data centers that are exorbitant, require a lot of energy and water to cool and so on. So it's a very resource heavy kind of approach. And personally, I think perhaps only the Americans and the Chinese have those kinds of resources to slug it out with that kind of approach. Now, meanwhile, in India, you have a very different, once again, very frugal approach, very much a lean spark approach, where we're saying, look, we don't have that kind of capital. We might have the talent, but we don't have the capital. We don't necessarily have the hardware, energy, etc., etc. In any case, let's say we did. There are other areas of the economy where we could devote those resources. And even if we did it focused, all that money on AI, if it's going to be so expensive to develop, then the solutions are also going to be expensive, and our folks are not going to be able to afford it. Remember, this is going back to what I said at the beginning. India has a very large population that's on lower incomes. To really be successful, what you want to have is highly affordable solutions that very large numbers of people can afford, and that's how you become economically successful. Now, with AI, we have the power to transform entire populations in education, in health, in agriculture, all these kinds of things by giving people, advice on their phones in their language, in voice. But to do that, we are adopting a very frugal approach, building on our Jugaad mindset, our experience. You have companies like Sarvam.ai, which are focusing on smaller large language models in specific Indian languages, where in any case you don't have that kind of corpus that you can scrape from the internet that you have in English. And they're focusing on specific areas of application, like primary education, health, etc. And they're doing this on edge devices in voice in people's local language. So Sarvam is doing it. The most recent example that's absolutely stunned me is Amul coming up with basically a similar solution for their cattle farmers. Tens of thousands of cattle farmers who in the past would struggle to figure out what to do if their cow was sick or they wanted to access some government scheme. And now Sarla Ben, as it's called, will tell them in Gujarati in voice on their phone what they need to do in a particular situation, give them advice and how to proceed and so on. And to do this, Amul has essentially built on 4 decades or more of data that they already had on the kinds of questions and challenges and the solutions that their cattle farmers, had and came up with. So I think now India is doing that, but it's the same situation for other developing countries. But I would argue even for smaller developed countries like the UK. The UK is chasing the Silicon Valley dream, but they don't have that kind of capital. They don't have that kind of talent. They should be perhaps looking more at the Indian model than at the US or Chinese model. And this would be true of France, of Germany, Italy, etc. So I think this LeanSpark thing is not just an Indian or even a developing economy thing. It has implications for pretty much most of the globe.
In fact, Utkarsh, we do have interest from different parts of the world to actually adapt the book LeanSpark for with more sort of global stories, in fact, stories from Europe, so that it can become more relevant to them. But I think the idea, the concept, the larger mindset which Mukesh was talking about is got a lot of acceptance, and the world will need to move towards leaner models of finding solutions. It won't be able to sustain over a period of time. And look, these are learnings from different developing countries also. So it's not, while we've talked about Indian stories, the concept of frugal and jugaad has been there in most of the developing world. So I think there's something to be learned from different parts of the world. But what's important is how are we scaling using tech in the rest of the world, and that has to be a little more ubiquitous than just say it's for a region or for a particular country.
Coming back to
Fascinating.
the story or the example that the question you started with, and Priyank also talked about it, is LeanSpark a ready answer to all problems? No. The Chinese example today, as Jaideep said, have resources. They can throw money at problems. But if you see the deep seek approach initially, it was the constraint that got them to think differently. And they were very successful at that. But as you mature and you have resources, then with the mindset of being frugal with the resources, you still throw resources at some problems that you feel will give you answers. So it's a mix of both approaches. We're not saying that this is the only approach, but this is an approach in a constrained environment till you see different results.
Utkarsh, I want to go back to something you raised earlier in the space context and actually talk a little bit about NASA and also ISRO. So, you pointed out that NASA, of course, ran into, basically they ran into a wall when their own costs were going up and they were not able to achieve their own missions and their objectives. So that's when they opened up to the private sector. And yes, there were large incumbents, but also a very interesting startup, SpaceX, which now probably will be the most valued company on the planet when they IPO. Which, by the way, I think also adopted a LeanSpark approach. They thought long term and they thought about affordability, and they thought about again some of the adaptive, scalability, and basically came up with the idea of a reusable rocket. I think that's like a very high tech, uh, LeanSpark approach example. And actually, that now has completely transformed the American space sector because you have this very lively and very interesting partnership between ISRO and a thriving space tech sector. And India and ISRO have done something similar, but in a very frugal way, where we now have a very thriving space tech sector. Of course, Mukesh was alluding to it. We have so many now startups uh, in India that are, working in that ecosystem along with ISRO to send, small satellites into space and, do all kinds of things that are again targeted to very specific use cases.
And the interesting part is that when these startups, which are now large companies like SpaceX, hired people, engineers, scientists, one of the conditions was that you have never worked with NASA because we want you to think differently. We want you to take a different approach to space exploration. So NASA has followed the traditional route. Now, can we think differently? And can that be a competitive advantage, which is an interesting question to ask.
Interestingly, I am interviewing this uh, HBS professor, Matthew Weinzel, about SpaceX and space economy later today. So I'll mention that the LeanSpark approach seems to cover the SpaceX model as well. And ISRO also is used as a launch provider for large companies like Rocket Lab, Planet Lab, and it has played a pivotal role not just in enabling the ecosystem for Indian startups, but also for other companies that are very large, which is a monumental achievement. We're coming towards the close of our discussion. So I want to focus on the process of editing and removing examples, deciding what to keep, because this is important. And as we've discussed, fairly expansive. So removing stuff is pretty challenging. How did you decide what to keep, what to remove? How did you structure the book? Are you happy with the final product? Talk us through the tensions in the room when you were going through all of this.
That's a very interesting question because, in a sense, you're asking us a question that's linked to this LeanSpark approach. One of the ways in which you can get affordability and simplicity in a solution is to defeature, is to remove features. You come up with a solution and then you say, okay, this is too expensive, let's remove features. This is too complex, let's remove features. But actually, I think if I may say this, and of course, Priyank and Mukesh can chip in, I think we adopted a LeanSpark approach to our own book in that we started with a very clear sense of, okay, what do we want to achieve from this book? As I said, that was part of the course, in fact. So we had been thinking about this for a while. And so there was a very deliberate design that, okay, we want to get, this is the objective we have, and how can we do this in the quickest way and the simplest way? And essentially, what we had done was we had assembled examples. We started with the nation building cases of UID, ISRO, AI, etc. And then we, worked also with what we had. And this is again a very Jugaad principle. Who do we know? What do we have with access to? And we started with our own students and so on. So, Priyank, I know this was your idea, and Mukesh also help to chip in with examples. So maybe Priyank, you could tell us, and then Mukesh can also chip in.
Yeah. So, Utkarsh, I think there were lots of stories, lots of examples that we kind of finally had to stitch together into the flow. But since you asked this question, I want to share one very interesting story that we sort of found, explored, even spoke to the founder, but for whatever editorial reasons we couldn't fit in. It's the story of Presspill. It's a company based, I think, in Aurangabad, where they are creating pellets out of stubble waste. And for those of us who are from North India, to understand what that means because of the kind of pollution issues the stubble burning causes. So he actually created pellets out of stubble waste. And guess what he's doing? He's created a model of what is called as an eco cremation. Now, cremations they require a lot of wood, and there are lots of cremations that happen every day in India, which kind of take away a lot of natural resources. And he's created pellets that can be used for cremations, and those kind of make it a very, very eco-friendly way of doing cremations at one-tenth the cost. And so many families that can't afford kind of wood and kind of resources that are required for cremations actually find a solution in what he's created. And by the way, what he does in the process of creating those pellets is also all completely based on biogas. So the process is sort of low resource and of course sustainable, but also the outcome becomes very, very interesting. And it's a reality of the world that we're living in. We need to find eco-friendly ways of departures. So that's one story I want to leave you with.
And another criteria I had was how many people can we talk to in the shortest possible time. Some
Mm.
people we could reach. We loved their stories based on what we had read about them, but we couldn't reach them. And we had a constraint in time. Publishers was keen. We were ourselves keen to get the book out. And some stories are now coming in that we wish we had put in. But then that's part of the publishing game, and probably in the next edition or the next book that we write, we'll probably include them.
In fact, Utkarsh, some of the LinkedIn posts that we are doing now have
Yeah.
stories that we couldn't cover. So they kind of take
Oh,
this.
that's very interesting. Maybe a LeanSpark newsletter would be another idea, but it's fascinating. Is there anything I should have asked that I didn't, or any a topic that you'd like to tell the audience about? Because the people who listen to our podcast are obviously not just from India. So for them, it's some of the terms like Amul, etc., would be so fascinating. I can't wait to include links in the podcast so that they have the context. But best way is to read the book, and I highly recommend that. But any other questions, insights, or stuff that we should have discussed that you'd like to leave the audience with?
Um, so a quick one, Utkarsh. One of the elements that we've touched upon, two elements that I want to talk about. One is that we've talked about a building of culture using the ideas of LeanSpark. So we've talked about,
Mm,
stories of the Jaipur Literature Festival, the Kochi
mm,
Biennale, influencers, politicians, how they have used ideas of LeanSpark to
mm.
sort of grow their organizations and grow themselves as people and have done well. So that's one element that I think readers would enjoy. The second part is on how large organizations, companies that are sort of giants, are also using ideas of LeanSpark.
Mm.
So we've talked about Google and how Google actually created Google Maps using the ideas of LeanSpark and how they actually relied on a network of auto drivers to actually map the first round of
Mm.
Google Maps. And the blue dot that we trust every day is an outcome of a lot of LeanSpark ideas that came about. And then there's another Fortune 100 company that actually uses a lot of innovation, and it encourages people in its organizations to follow processes, of course, but also have time and space for innovation. So large companies can also lean spark, and that's a very important message we want to leave the listeners with.
The
Fascinating.
final thing I would say is that there are also the last chapter we have a toolkit for people who want to actually apply this approach themselves in their own context. So that might be also something of relevance to the readers who
Yeah.
have their own startup or are thinking of it or have a company that they work in where they can actually try their hands at learning and applying this approach.
Or just their team. I think it can work for a team as well.
Mm.
And we've called it the Frugal Innovation Canvas, very similar to the building, the business model canvas that companies use. This is the Frugal Innovation Campus, which we have run through a few programs, and people find it very useful.
Well, I love the framework. I sincerely appreciate your friendship, mentorship. I thank you all for writing this book. Obviously, my favorite case study was ISRO, but Amul is a close second. I hope you include it in the newsletter or LinkedIn posts soon. Thank you all so much for doing this. Can't wait to have you back soon. Take care.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Utkarsh. Thanks a
Bye.
lot.
Bye,
Bye.
Thank
Hitesh.
you.
Bye. Bye.